Hello students, welcome back to our course on the SAT. Today we are going to do the introduction to the punctuation. The whole of punctuations is probably very important on the SAT because you can definitely expect 3 to 4 questions based out of punctuations on the SAT on every test that you encounter. So let's start. These are basically the punctuation marks on English. So we have got the period or the full stop. All of us know all those, the question mark, the exclamation point and things like that. But for the use of SAT, we don't need to understand all of these punctuation marks. One might ask that what is so special about the punctuation marks, but the SAT treats these punctuation marks to demarcate between the boys and the men. So they would ask you basically almost every rule, not all though, all of them you would encounter when you take tests like GMAT or maybe even the GRE. But for the SAT, there are some of the punctuation marks and some rules on those punctuation marks which become very critical or very important. So which are those? So for the purpose of SAT, the comma is the first one that we need to understand. There is no serial number, but then we need to understand how a comma works on the SAT. We need to understand how semicolon works. We need to understand how a colon works. We need to understand how an M dash works. Okay, so there are 3 types of dashes: the M dash, the N dash, and the hyphen. Yeah, and the hyphen, this one. We are not really worried about the N dash and the hyphen. They're never asked on the SAT, right? So we need to understand how an M dash works. So these are the 5 punctuation marks that become super critical for us to understand at least some rules of them on the SAT. Before we start with our punctuation marks directly, there are some definitions that we need to understand. The first definition that you need to understand is about phrases and clauses. So obviously, what is a phrase and what is a clause? A clause is a group of words that contain a subject and a verb. This is very important for us to understand the phrases and clauses. Obviously, this is elementary grammar, but then we need to still understand, because everywhere that we use our punctuations, we will have to understand what kind of phrases and what kind of clauses are we dealing with. And a phrase is a group of words that does not contain the subject and a verb, or the main subject and the verb. So what are the types of phrases? The noun phrase starts with a noun. The verb phrase which starts with a verb. The appositive phrase. Appositive basically means the same thing said over and over again. As for example, my mother, a good cook, cooked rice. Example, right? So my mother, same thing, a good cook. A good cook is nothing but my mother. That's an appositive. Okay, so appositive phrase is basically an appositive, but it is more than one word. So a good cook out here, this is a phrase. Okay, so my dinner, a spicy vegetable curry, nothing but my dinner. And the prepositional phrase, as we have already discussed while we did preposition, why prepositional phrases are very important. Now we come to the most important part, to the introduction of the punctuations, which are the clauses. We need to definitely understand these 4 types of clauses. The first one is an independent clause. Basically, speaking of it in simple words, an independent clause is nothing but a full sentence. An independent clause is nothing but a full sentence, or a part of a sentence that would stand even if we put a full stop after that sentence. These independent clauses may be relative to each other. I'll give you some examples. Obviously, we have an example out here. I love chocolate cookies, and definitely you can put a full stop after that. Now, you might argue that who's this I, because there is no reference to this I. I is definitely a pronoun and there is no name mentioned. But then still, it stands as an independent clause. So even if it is a relative independent clause, which it is right now out here, because there has to be some reference to the I somewhere, still it stands as a full sentence, and hence it is an independent clause. So let's understand with a simpler sentence or maybe a compound sentence. Let's say Peter went to UK. He traveled by a train. And he traveled by a train. Peter went to UK. He traveled by a train. Peter went to UK. You can put a full stop and you can start with a he, which is a capital, and hence both of these are independent clauses. So that is the basic definition of an independent clause, wherein you can actually put a full stop and the sentence will stand on its own. That's an independent clause. What is a dependent clause? A dependent clause is something that would not stand as a full sentence. So let's modify this sentence and put an and out here. Okay, so now how it goes: Peter went to the UK, and he traveled by a train. Now this part, when you start looking at it from and, you will find that and he traveled by a train. So let's write this aloud. And he traveled by a train is definitely, you cannot put a full stop out here. Doesn't make any sense. And he traveled by a train. Not a complete sentence. This kind of a clause will be called a dependent clause. So I guess the demarcation between an independent clause and a dependent clause is pretty clear. An independent clause is something that stands as a sentence and a full stop can be put after that. And a dependent clause is a one that we cannot use a full stop after, like this one. Once we have used an and before he, it ceases to become an independent clause and is transformed into a dependent clause, a relative clause. A relative clause is nothing but wherein we have got a referencing to an independent clause. So a relative clause begins with a relative pronoun, generally who, whom, whose, which, that. That means that we are referencing to something or someone or some place or that has already been mentioned somewhere before. He knew instantly whose voice he had called out, whose voice. Okay, so referencing to something, that's a relative clause. We would not be using relative clause that frequently on the SAT, but imperative that we understand what is an independent clause and what is a dependent clause. And the next one, these are the three most important concepts that we have to understand before we start with the punctuation: the non-restrictive or the non-essential clause. So a non-essential or a non-restrictive clause is nothing. These are words and phrases or clause that are necessary for the sentence to make sense. So let's take an example. These are additional information in a piece of sentence. It is not necessary that those, so if you remove that part also, the sentence makes perfect sense. So let's take an example. I'll write an example. Obviously, we might have taken an example out here, but I'll write an example. The history book. The history book, right? The history book is in the cupboard. The history book is in the cupboard. Perfect. Good sentence. Now out here, left the space. Now write some additional information out here. The history book I used, or I read, whatever, in school is in the cupboard. The history book I read in, I used in school is in the cupboard. Okay, so now the sentence reads, the history book I used in school is in the cupboard. But the initial sentence was, the history book is in the cupboard. This makes perfect sense. And hence this part of the sentence will be called a non-restrictive clause, because if it is removed from the sentence altogether, still the sentence makes perfect sense. The history book is in the cupboard. I used in school is nothing but additional information. This kind of a clause is called a non-restrictive clause. Most appositives, mostly all appositives, would be non-restrictive in nature. Now the punctuations on the SAT. As I've already told you that there are 5 punctuations which are of importance on the SAT. The commas, the semicolons, colons, dashes and appositives. In the introduction to the punctuations, we are just going to have a quick look as to what the functioning of commas, semicolons, colons, dashes and apostrophes are. Ideally, normally, if you ask what is the use of a comma, most people would say that whenever we need a pause in a sentence, we would use a comma. But SAT doesn't look at it that way. SAT looks at specific uses of a comma. So, comma should only be used to separate lists. Okay, these are lists, a table, a sander, and lots of glue. So, one use of a comma, separate lists. We are going to delve into this from the SAT perspective in the lectures to follow. This is just an introduction as to what commas are. They are used to demarcate the non-essential or non-restrictive clauses from a body of from a sentence. So, as for example, the Bay of Fundy, a body of water between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, experiences the world's highest tidal range. So, this part, as you can see, a body of water between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick is nothing but the Bay of Fundy. So, the sentence could have simply read, the Bay of Fundy experiences the world's highest tidal wave. So, this is a non-restrictive clause and hence has to be demarcated by a comma on both sides. They link dependent clauses to independent clauses, always like this. While they were once endangered by commercial whaling, humpback whale populations have recently grown at a rapid rate. So, this part is an independent clause. You can put a full stop after that anyhow with an H capital. Humpback whale populations have recently grown at a rapid rate. It's perfectly an independent clause, but this part, while they were once endangered by commercial whaling, would not stand as an independent clause. So, this is the dependent part and this is the independent part. A comma is used to demarcate between a dependent and an independent clause or an independent and a dependent clause. It is used to link an independent clause with the help of a coordinating conjunction. While we have done the conjunction, we now know that we have got certain kind of conjunctions like the coordinating conjunction, the subordinate conjunctions. We have also got the adverbs which act as conjunctions. So, we are looking at a comma when it comes to the coordinating conjunctions, the fanboy conjunctions mostly. So, we always need to have a comma before the fanboys, wherever we find the fanboys. Almonds are the most consumed tree nut, but. So, whenever we have this but, which is a fanboy conjunction, we need to have a comma. For the fanboy conjunctions and the definition of conjunctions, you can go back to the parts of speech and have a lesson on the conjunctions. Comma should not split a subject and a verb. You can look at this. We will do this in details when we come to the commas. Okay, so like this one, the mountain goats are very nimble. So, you cannot put a comma out here, subject and a verb. And commas before the prepositions. Let's look at this. The chicken crossed to the other side of the road. No, we don't use a comma before a prepositional phrase. The correct one is the chicken crossed to the other side of the road. And separate a list of 2. This one we are going to see in detail when we do the comma rules. The semicolons, separate a list of an item which already has commas. Okay, something like this. The United Nations headquartered in New York City is also has central offices in Nairobi, Kenya, right? Geneva, Switzerland, and Vienna, Austria. But then, as you can see, that these are groups. Nairobi and Kenya become the same group, and Geneva and Switzerland become the same group. So, this is incorrect because you just cannot put commas in the middle because this becomes very confusing. So, you have to use semicolons between the major groups. We are going to do this also when we do the semicolon rules, and they are also used to link independent clauses with another independent clause. So independent clause and independent clause, you can put a semicolon in the middle. The most common, obviously, the most common punctuation you can put is a period, but if they are closely related to each other, then we can use a semicolon as well. Humans have always been troubled by dry skin. Lotions and moisturizers have a history reaching back to ancient times. So this is a closely related independent clause, and hence a semicolon can be put. What about colons? Colons are generally used for extra information and lists. Obviously, colons are always after independent clauses. So we are going to do this when we do our colons. Dashes obviously have got two basic functions. One, they replace commas sometimes. They replace commas sometimes, and they also replace colons sometimes. So they sometimes replace commas. They sometimes replace commas and sometimes replace colons. When and how, we are going to look at that when we come to the actual lesson on the dashes, on the part of the dashes. And apostrophes have got two basic functions, one concision and two possession. We are going to look at that when we delve into apostrophes. So stay tuned. Coming up next is the comma rule 1.